From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. President Donald Trump has rolled out a series of decisions and executive orders, of course, with the big focus on tariffs. One change flying under the radar is the tweak to the de minimis policy. That is a rule dating back all the way to the 1930s. While it might not grab headlines, it is sparkling concerns across industries about its potential ripple effects on global trade. What does this shift mean for businesses and consumers? How will supply chains around the world adjust? And how do we keep fair and free trade alive amid all these challenges? Joining us to unpack all this, we have Deborah Elms, head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation, joining us from Jakarta. We also have Charles Liu, senior fellow at the Taihe Institute here in Beijing. And Han Hua is co-founder and secretary general of the Beijing Club for International Dialogue, also joining us in Beijing. Welcome to you all. Deborah, if I may go to you first, President Trump threatened new tariffs on automobile products, chips, semiconductors coming into the United States. That might be taking into effect. On top of that, there is this de minimis policy announced by the United States, by the Trump administration, which was, by the way, first introduced in the 1930s. What do you make of all this? Can you elaborate on what this de minimis policy is all about?
Sure. So I think the first thing to note is that Trump does think that tariffs are the most beautiful word in the English language, which means that he is a big fan. And he is clearly interested in using tariffs for a wide variety of reasons. And one thing that has caught his attention that is irritating to him is that we have a category of goods that come into the United States that are not charged tariffs. Those are products that are below $800 per day. And the argument behind why those come in duty-free or tariff-free is because the cost of collecting tariffs from low-value goods, sort of, one iPhone case, let's say, or one jacket, is so much greater than the cost of the tariff collection that it's faster and easier to simply allow or waive through products below that de minimis level. This, however, means that they're not being charged tariffs, and that's a problem for Trump. And so the argument he has made is that for Chinese products coming in on de minimis, that they should be suspended and no longer be allowed to send any value goods, $0 goods, through to the United States with de minimis. That would apply the full value of tariffs to every single product coming into the United States.
What kind of an impact will this de minimis policy have on, Chinese trade flow to the United States if you consider the 10% tariff on steel and aluminum on top of other tariffs or pending tariffs that are yet to come?
It could be fairly significant because under de minimis, you don't have to pay any existing tariffs and no taxes. And so if you think about what are the tariff levels now applied to Chinese goods, there may be tariffs on the original product. In other words, like a jacket has a certain tariff for all countries that would now have to be applied. Those can be quite high. So for textiles and apparel, for example, often 20 to 40%, plus any Section 301 tariffs, which are currently not collected, would have to be collected, plus the additional 10% that is now, as of a couple weeks ago, imposed on all Chinese imports. So suddenly you go from no tariffs at all to up to 3 different kinds of tariff collection plus taxes. This is going to really change the pricing of products from China into the United States if the suspension is lifted. In other words, if they then say we are now back in action, no more de minimis for Chinese imports.
All right, Han Hua, let me turn to you. Donald Trump is rolling out the tariffs against not only China, but first and foremost the European Union, Canada, and Mexico, some of which are America's longest and most staunch allies in the world. As a Chinese scholar, what do you make of all this?
Donald Trump's intention in terms of long-term intention is to make deal not only with China, but with the rest of the world, because he is a born deal maker. So for the tariffs, maybe it's only the very first step for him to try to reach a balance between the American reindustrialization and the current status quo of Americans losing this kind of manufacturing jobs to other markets, to other countries, especially to China. So this is not a surprise to us, to China especially, because China has already been preparing for these tariffs and taxes even before Trump back to the Oval Office. So for the other markets, that might be a huge surprise, especially for the American allies. But overall, this shows that Trump's intention to deepen the global trend of deglobalization in the economic sphere. So this is a trend, and this move by the Trump administration just proves this trend is going deeper. And then it will have significant impact to the American households in particular, because these tariffs adopted to low-valued goods are actually a most necessary for the low-income American families. They cannot be affordable anymore for these low-valued goods, especially imported from China. So this is a very significant impact. And I think the retreat from this policy towards the Chinese imports is that showing that the infrastructure of the customs and also the technology capacity of the customs are not capable of this policy. So that needs a long term to beef up, these capacities of American governance and these customs technology and other capacities in particular. So this will have a long-term impact, and overall, it's part of Trump's deal.
Deborah, let me ask you this. Are there discussions inside the Beltway or outside as well in the United States about historical parallels? Because we do remember the 1930s Smoot-Hawley Act, that is a similar situation whereby the U.S. administration's levied tariffs on imported goods that had negative long-term social and strategic consequences, of course with short-term gains on top of that. What do you think?
Trump himself keeps saying that we should go back to 1913 or before. In part, he thinks because you could finance the U.S. government through the application of tariffs. So if the United States collected tariffs or collected enough revenue from tariffs, either you could get rid of the income tax, which he thinks is a great idea, or at least offset some of the tax cuts that he intends to do. So neither one of those makes sense mathematically. No matter how you do this, there's not enough revenue collected from tariffs. But I think it indicates his mindset, which is, I'm going to collect tariffs, and I'm going to collect them regularly and often, and I'm going to collect them against those that I like and those that I don't like. So if you are calm about Trump's perspective on tariffs, then I think you're not paying attention. He is going to collect tariff revenues in any way that he possibly can. And I think we should all be prepared for that kind of scenario, whether it's low value packages under de minimis, large value packages, whether it's automobiles or semiconductors or food products, whatever it is, he is a huge fan of tariffs. And I think that is important to remember, given how much of U.S. policymaking at the moment is concentrated in his personal hands.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Charles, let me ask you this. If you look at headlines these days, the European Union decided to provide aid to Ukraine at the sum of billions of dollars. This happened right after American and Russian officials met in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, preparing for a post-war arrangement, a post-war situation. Of course, the European Union's shipment of arms or potential shipment of arms to Ukraine upsets people in the United States. Do we already see a strategic rift of sort between the European Union and the US, and the Trump's tariffs will no doubt, hurt this process, make it even worse?
There's absolutely no question that's the direction. The population in Riyadh are not very well tuned into these world geopolitical issues, but the elite are very, very happy that Riyadh was chosen. But for the Europeans, you will recall when the Russian-Ukraine conflict broke out, the Europeans were told by the Americans that although this is your issue, you have to contribute more. You have to give more weapons. You have to provide more support to the Ukrainians because the Russians are going to threaten you. And now all of a sudden, the tune has changed. We'll make a deal with the Russians. You Europeans stand on the sidelines. You're not even invited to participate. That's absolutely shocking, I think, to many Europeans. And for the Ukrainians, it's even more shocking. Sorry, you have to sign a contract, turn over all your mineral and precious resources over to the Americans to receive the further support. I think democracy that's shown here with the US is absolutely amazing. And they do it bluntly and openly and frankly without any even signs of embarrassment.
Yeah, Deborah, on that note, let me ask you this. For businesses, especially small businesses, they have to think about their supply chains, right? Upstream, downstream, who they buy their products from and who they sell their products to. During Trump 1.0, we see the phenomena such as friendshoring and nearshoring. And during Trump 2.0, with tariffs and all these protectionist policies, what do you expect to happen this time around?
I think it's going to be harder for firms to navigate access to the U.S. market through any method. So if you want to move into Southeast Asia and then manufacture here and then send to the United States, I think that's going to get hard, especially if there's any Chinese content involved in whatever the thing is that's being made. So I think firms are going to have to think much harder about why they want to access the U.S. market. It has been the biggest and the most lucrative, and it's therefore much easier for firms to just stick with the United States as a trade destination, because at the end of the day, no one else will buy the same kinds of products in the same kinds of quantities. But if you make it expensive enough and difficult enough, then firms will have to think twice and say, is this the moment when it's worth it to me to either find new markets, find new buyers, change up what I produce? Because maybe there was an interesting story about a firm that was trying to sell Christmas ornaments and Christmas lights and so forth. And if you're not going to sell them to the Americans, then who else will buy them? And the answer is nobody in the same quantity and the same price levels and so forth. So you may have to change up what you do in order to make that effective.
Yeah, people sometimes forget, but the United States has, the third largest population anywhere in the world, only behind India and China. A big consumer market.
It's a huge consumer market, and it's very deep-pocketed. And despite all of the ups and downs in the global economy, U.S. consumers have continued to spend. And so if you're in that space, it's hard for you to say, yes, it's disruptive and yes, it's challenging, but I'm going to give up 3 times the value that I can get selling to the United States and sell it to somebody else. That's very hard for firms to do, which is why the United States continues to have this sort of magnetic pull that might not otherwise make sense.
Countries are talking about resilience strategies. That is how they can diversify and maneuver through these muddy waters and these policy fluctuations to build resilience, to diversify their portfolio and diversify their suppliers in order to not just make ends meet, but turn a profit. What are your thoughts on this regard? How can countries and businesses build resilience, really?
Well, still take the U.S. market as a very good example, and take the Chinese manufacturing made in China, because there are so many big manufacturers, and there are also a lot more small and medium-sized Chinese factories and companies still wanting to enter into the U.S. market, the only single lucrative market with a very strong expenditure and the spending habits are still there, and the high valued results are still there. So I think this resilience shows for the Chinese side is that on one side, for the big companies, especially for the e-commerce platforms, they are building more like closing the last mile of the sales and the manufacturing productivity activity in the United States, in the market, on the spot. So these e-commerce platforms like Temu in particular, they are building a big, warehouses in the U.S. They are collaborating with U.S. local manufacturers and especially U.S. local trade partners to handle this e-commerce platforms operations, TikTok as a new emerging platform as well. On the other side, the Chinese medium-sized and small-sized companies, they are united domestically as a comparatively large kilometers. For example, like the media and the cultural product, Ne 2, there are so many contributors. There are so many medium and small-sized companies working together to produce this big super blockbuster domestically, and they bring their products. It's not a small products anymore. It's still a very good, in terms of investment, return on investment. It is still profitable. It is still competitive in terms of their market value, and they bring this product and material product together, and they bring it to the U.S. market. I think that both approaches show the resilience of China as a provider in this trading partnership.
I thought that was a great example. I mean, as we speak, Ne 2 is the most successful animated film in terms of box office revenue anywhere in the world. Charles, how do you evaluate the resilience strategies of Chinese firms? You've been traveling between China and the Middle East quite a bit over the years.
First and foremost, China itself is a very big market. Because of the Chinese market, you can create economies of scale that cannot be rivaled anywhere. No other country has the manufacturing. China is now manufacturing over 35% of the world's total manufacturing products. So if your own market is big enough, you can create efficiencies and economies of scale that others are very hard to catch up to. Secondly, diligence. And this is something that I identified with many Chinese companies that went abroad. In many other countries, it's difficult to find a working population that's as enthusiastic about working and gaining more in terms of income. The third part, which I think is the most significant part, as exemplified by the ASEAN countries' relationship with China, is the ASEAN countries are now part of the China supply chain. They don't do complete products. They don't have complete supply chains for any product that's from raw material all the way to finished product. They do a piece of it. So in terms of globalization, this has really meant that they've become part of the Chinese supply chain and cored in the Chinese market. So these are things which make China's economy very resilient.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Right. Deborah, let me ask you this. I mean, from an American point of view, with all the companies, be it SOEs or privately owned enterprises in place, how are they navigating through Trump's tariffs and build resilience?
Well, I think companies in the U.S., especially multinationals, are struggling to figure out how to navigate what is becoming, I guess, a new normal. Most US companies, especially the large ones, have at least some and often predominantly an overseas presence. So trying to figure out how to maintain that global presence at a time when Trump is requesting companies to return back to the United States is challenging, because for many companies, they can't do whatever it is that they do, especially we're talking about trading goods here, not trading services. But manufacturing companies of all kinds rely on overseas inputs, whether that's raw materials or parts or components or even services sourced from abroad to be assembled in things often abroad to be returned to the United States. That's the system that American companies have grown up with for decades. And at the moment, they're uncertain about what is the impact for their own businesses and what is the likely picture going forward. How hard will it be to be an American company operating overseas? How hard will it be to be an American company operating with overseas inputs in the United States? And then, some really difficult questions about if the world starts to split into regions or groupings or whatever, what happens to global multinationals that have an American background? Like, which way do they go? I think it's early days, but the level of confusion and concern, I think, is rising among companies that are at least American headquartered or traditionally see themselves as American firms.
Deborah, let me ask you one more question. I mean, how will this all end, right? There's such a thing as WTO, a world body under the United Nations that is supposed to regulate, legislate, traffic control when it comes to trade disputes and trade battles. But where is WTO at this point? I mean, with unilateral tariffs and counter tariffs, how will this all go and make WTO look?
Well, I think it's very hard to be hopeful for the global trade regime. I would like to be more optimistic, but they've just held 2 days of important meetings in Geneva on this topic. And at the end of it, the members themselves, it's a member-driven organization, the 166 members couldn't agree on whether they could move forward in smaller groupings. And if you can't move forward in smaller groupings, then you're stuck, because the United States is unlikely to move ahead with the others. So right there, we don't have 166 moving in the same direction. I think it's very troubling. I think that the global economy has been built on a set of rules for decades, our lifetimes really, that is undermined very, very quickly now. And I'm not sure that anyone has figured out what happens when you don't have that present. I often describe the WTO as like oxygen. It's just there. It's the rails on which business moves back and forth. If the oxygen is now sucked out of the room, what happens? I think we're about to find that actually we really relied on that. And if it's not functioning or not functioning as it was, it's going to get much more challenging for firms to do business in the way that they used to do business. But I don't know what that picture looks like. And I'm not sure that anyone else has any idea what it looks like either, except to say it's changing very rapidly in ways that could be very problematic for people who've grown up with the expectation that you create and you consume from the world.
It is a fluid situation, and like you said, it is in its early days. Fingers crossed. Han Hua, people have been talking about China's response or potential response. So far, counter tariffs have been announced by Chinese Commerce Ministry. People have been talking about what China's foreign policy will look like in the new year. We've heard from Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Munich and also at the United Nations earlier on. How do you think China will respond to all this? Will China stand up to, like it once did, and as it has always been doing, stand up to bully and external pressure?
I think that's mild, that's very self-constrained. And I think back at home, China is much more ready, to have different counteractions towards U.S. Compared to 4 or 8 years ago. So because China is much more ready in terms of the tactics in terms of the capabilities. And also China is also moving very fast with its own manufacturing capacity, with its own technological advancement. This gives China very solid foundation to have countermeasures towards the foreign trade policies moving against China. So Wang Yi's speech at Munich Security Conference, it is a security conference, but Wang Yi definitely touched upon a lot about the overall China's foreign policy, especially in the context of the rising geopolitical tensions. This year, the Munich Security Conference theme is about the multipolar world. So it shows that even the European countries are seriously discussing about the possibility the world is turning to a multipolar world. So this echoes China's efforts and initiatives about the world development in a longer term.
Charles, you come from Riyadh, so let me ask you this. Marco Rubio talking with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, resolving the issue on Ukraine so that they can focus better and focus more on pivoting towards containing China. True or false? I mean, there's a theory that has been pushed around.
The intention may be there, but whether or not it would happen or it could happen is very much in doubt. I think Sergei Viktorovich Lavrov is an old hand compared to the US side, who are very green in the field. I think there is such an attempt, there is such a thesis behind it, but it will probably not happen because I don't even think they will be able to resolve the Ukraine issue anytime soon.
All right, Charles, Han Hua, and Deborah, thank you all so very much. We learned a lot, and that will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Thanks so much for tuning in. Our news coverage continues. Bye, and take care.